Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. Buenas noches, damas y caballeros, chicos y chicas, niños de todas edades, y bienvenidos a el Karey Carbaugh podcast, número 13. Welcome to the Karey Carbaugh podcast, number 13, episode number 13. Can you believe we are into teen numbers now? A couple months ago, if you'd have asked me if I was going to be doing a podcast, I would have probably laughed, although I had friends that were trying to get me to do this for several months. But that sort of brings me to the topic for tonight. I'll explain a little bit more about that as we get into it. I do apologize that I'm running a little bit late again tonight. That'll become more clear as I go through a fantastic opportunity that I just came home from yesterday. So I hadn't really had time to prepare this podcast until I got home from work tonight, and needed a little bit of extra time to get ready here. So I do apologize. I'll try to get back more on schedule by next week, because I know I was a little bit late starting last week and then again this week. So my apologies. I know my speech teacher in high school told me never apologize at the beginning of a speech for what you're going to talk about. So enough of that. Tonight's topic is, you may have noticed from the title, God doesn't call gifted people. Now, what did I mean by that? Once again, as you probably know by now, I am a believer. I'm a Christian. I don't throw that or thrust that on anybody. I don't push anybody. But I also don't hide it either. I'm open to having conversations with people. If they'd like to explore their own faith, learn more about my faith, I'm open to that. But I also respect people where they're at and want to bring them into the fold where I'm at. So I'm feeling somewhat called in that direction for these podcasts. And so I hope this is something that you all are feeling drawn into. Because I feel like God is really leading me to making this somewhat of a casual place where we can talk about faith, talk about our calling. And as I've mentioned, I am visually impaired, and so I'll talk about a few ways that I'm not particularly gifted, but God has given me gifts that I never would have thought possible, that were certainly not part of my plan along the way, but clearly they've become part of my plan because they are part of His plan. And so let's dive into this tonight. If you're watching me live, if you'd give me an L or a live in the comments, I would greatly appreciate that. And as we're going through this, I will try to stop periodically and ask if you're getting value. Hopefully you are. I always appreciate the comments. I truly do appreciate the support that you all have given me in doing these. So God does not call the gifted. The second part of that is that He gifts, or He qualifies those that He calls, and those who are called according to His purpose. So He doesn't call people that are gifted or qualified, but He qualifies those whom He calls. That's the second half of the story that I didn't put in the title of this. And we see this in the Bible. I'm going to reference a couple of biblical passages. I'm not going to have as many of these as I had thought I would probably do, because I didn't have time enough to do some of the research that I was intending to. And again, I'll explain that here in a minute. I don't want to share that too soon, although I sort of gave a spoiler alert in the last podcast. But we see this beginning in Exodus chapter 4, where Moses is called to do several things. And he says to God, he says, I don't speak well. And you're wanting me to lead these people, and you're wanting me to speak to these people when I don't really speak that well. I have heard some believe that Moses may have even had somewhat of a speech impediment. We don't know that. That's not really ever shared in the Bible. But from some of the comments, particularly in chapter 4 of Exodus, we can assume that he was not an orator or an orator. So he didn't do a lot of oratory well. But God's response to that was, who do you think gave you a tongue? Who do you think gave you a mouth? Who gives people their ability to hear or their ability to see? Those are some specifics that God calls out. And he points out that he, the Creator, whatever you believe that is, I believe it's God, but he points out that the Creator gives these gifts. And so for us to say that we are not gifted in a way that the Creator calls us to serve is somewhat contrary to the idea that the gifts come from him to begin with, or come from this Spirit to begin with. So the Bible mentions that beginning in Exodus, and we see several examples throughout scriptures, throughout the Bible. Another clear example, and I'm looking down at my phone here for notes, if you're wondering what I'm doing. Another clear example is in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. This verse reminds us that it is not that we think we are qualified to do anything on our own. Our qualification rather, comes from God. If God called you, he will equip you. It may take him some time to do it. It may not happen immediately like we want, and it may take some learning. There may be a learning curve. God may have to teach us some lessons in order to qualify us. But in the end, he will provide us with the skills and the qualifications needed to do the work that he has set out for us to do. Let me give you some examples from my own life. I've mentioned that I've been on several mission trips, and most of those have been to Mexico with a church group. And I recall back to the first time that I went on a mission trip, or actually backing up even a little bit before that. I was asked by someone in our congregation to join the mission trip to Mexico. And I looked at her and I said, why would I want to go to Mexico? First of all, you all are going to be doing construction projects, and I'm not particularly equipped or gifted in construction work, particularly as someone with a vision impairment. That's just not something that's really been high on my list of things to learn to do. And so I said to her, I said, what the heck could I offer to this mission team that was, at that time, was primarily doing construction work? That was their primary purpose for going down there. Well, we got down there. She talked me into going. And I also said, I don't speak that much Spanish. I took it in high school, took it in junior high school, but at that time it had been 20 plus years, 22, 23 years since I had studied any Spanish. And I hadn't really used it that much. I used it a little bit in college. I had a roommate that was from Spain, and I would speak with his mother some in Spanish, but not really that much. And even that was a good 10 plus years prior to going to Mexico. So I really didn't have that much Spanish to offer either, and I wasn't sure that I had any skills to offer the team, quite honestly. Well, we got down to Mexico, and I will admit my stomach was a little bit tipsy, topsy-turvy, because I didn't know what the heck I was doing there. But I was making small talk with the pastor and some of the people in the congregation. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Estoy bien. I'm very fine. How are you? Very, very basic conversation. And the ministry coordinator looks at me and he goes, "Oh, good, you speak Spanish." And I looked at him and I said, "Muy poquito." Very, very little. He said, "That's great." He said, "Chuy, who is the pastor," he said, "Chuy's going to give your group a history of the valley. Why don't you translate?" And I looked at him and I said, "There's no way. There's no way." He said, No, it's okay." He said, "I'll be here to help you with the words you don't understand." And I said, "Yeah, like every other word? Or even probably every word? Most every word?" But what I didn't realize at the time that was happening is by thrusting me into that, I developed a relationship and a rapport with Pastor Chuy, and he learned how to speak to me in words that I could understand in Spanish, much like speaking to a 3-year-old who has a very limited vocabulary, but you learn how to speak in words that they can understand. And so Chuy quickly adapted to my limited level of Spanish. And yes, the other ministry coordinator, I believe his name was Bob. It's been a number of years since I've seen him. I'm not even sure that he's with us anymore. But he helped me with a lot of the words. Pastor Chuy figured out the words that I understood and then helped me to grow my vocabulary from that starting point. So this is an example of where God didn't gift me to translate prior to getting there. He didn't call me because I was gifted, but he qualified me, or he gifted me to fulfill the purpose once we got there. And through that, Pastor Chuy eventually moved up here to Colorado as a pastor, was on a pastor's visa, and became almost literally my Spanish teacher. And so now I would not consider myself to be fluent in Spanish, but I'm conversant in Spanish. All that because I answered the calling and said yes to going on a mission trip to Mexico around 1992 or 93. I don't remember exactly when I first went. It was either 1992 or 1993. So it's been a good 32 or 33 years ago when I first started going. Through that, little did any of us know that the mission trips and the mission of the church in Agua Prieta, Mexico, was quickly going to change from construction to more of a relational ministry. And so while I was not gifted or qualified for construction work, I dug a few holes while I was down there, and I helped lay some rebar and smooth out some concrete, and helped with some destruction of some buildings that we expanded and reconstructed. For the most part, very shortly after I started going, the ministry shifted to one of more relational-based ministry. And so to this day, I have a number of friends, people that I would call somewhat close friends, brothers and sisters in Christ, in Mexico, Again, because I said yes to that call the first time. So that's one example of where God qualifies those that are called according to his purpose. Coming back to a little bit of biblical reference, we see this throughout Jesus' ministry. The people that he called to do his ministry, to be his disciples, they were not the teachers and the leaders, the church rabbis of the Jewish faith. Those were not the people that he called. Rather, he called people who were fishermen. He himself was a carpenter. These were people who didn't really have religious skills. They may have had some religious teaching. They learned from Jesus. But when they were initially called, they were not gifted. They were not the people that people of the day would have said, these are the people that are going to be called by Jesus or by the Savior to be his disciples. They would have probably guessed the rabbis, the Pharisees, who were the church leaders of the time. Those would have been the people that they would have picked who were more qualified. But no, God called the people that were not qualified so that he could give them the qualifications that he wanted and that he needed for his purpose. Another example in my own life, getting back to why I was a little bit late getting started tonight. As I mentioned in my podcast last week, and I believe I might have mentioned it the week before. I know I've mentioned it a couple times. I was invited with our local community choir to sing at Carnegie in New York City. We did this past Sunday. It was a sellout crowd, which was pretty exciting for us. But I've told several people this wasn't even on my bucket list. There's no way, if you'd have told me a year ago that I'd be singing at Carnegie Hall in my lifetime, much less in the next year, there's no way. But the opportunity presented itself. Again, we were maybe not totally qualified initially, but through practice, and we had some pretty intense rehearsals prior to the concert. We were there for 4 or 5 days. We became qualified and did a concert at Carnegie, which I'm not sure it was completely note for note perfect, but I certainly was pretty proud of the outcome, and we've heard from people who heard us that it was a good concert. Not only were we there, but there were a number of high school kids that performed with us. Not professionals. And actually, I was talking with one of the staff members at Carnegie who said to me this concert was a little bit different than many of the ones that they host. Partly because there were so many people from so many different choirs. Usually they'll have a consistent group from one choir that comes in to do a performance, or they may have 2 or 3 different choirs, but they'll perform separately. It's very rare, they said, that they have choirs that meld together into one choir, from multiple choirs into one choir, to perform on stage together. Or bands or orchestras. It's very rare that they'll have multiple groups come together. But it was quite an experience. It really, I feel very blessed to have had the opportunity. Probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I never say never, because you never know what's going to come up. But likely a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And just an amazing experience. One that as I say, I feel very blessed to have had. Just the feeling of standing there on stage, as my brother mentioned in one of the comments that he put on one of my posts, it was, I forget exactly how he put it, but it was both awesome, awe-inspiring, and surreal at the same time, standing there. I'd been to Carnegie before, attending a concert. When I lived in New York, our church organist had accompanied a group on stage at Carnegie, and a group of us from church attended that concert. We sat in a box. We bought out a whole box for box seats at Carnegie. I thought that was pretty special. Never dreamed that I would be on stage, so it was both awesome and awe-inspiring, and at the same time rather surreal. But that's another example of where God qualified those of us who were called according to his purpose. Not to say that everything in life is directly God's purpose, but I do believe that our path and our steps through life fulfill his ultimate purpose. And I do believe, I've come to believe over the years, that God will qualify us if we are doing the work that fulfills his purpose. And sometimes we think we are, and we find out that we are not qualified and are not becoming qualified. I've seen a few examples of that in my own life too. I'm not able to think of any at the moment, but I believe that is also the case, that we are often led away from something which may not be directly in support of his ultimate purpose. I hope you're getting value from this. If you are, please put a V or a value in the comments. And once again, if you're watching this live, I'd appreciate a live or an L in the comments. If you're watching on the replay, drop an R or a replay. Maybe you have some examples in your own life where God has qualified you, or if you don't believe in God, where you have maybe jumped into something where you didn't particularly feel qualified. And through learning and through observation, maybe, you gained the skills needed to fulfill whatever purpose you were set out to do. Let me know if you have some examples in your own life. I'd be very interested to hear those. I've had a number of instances where I have certainly felt God calling me out of my comfort zone into areas where I was not particularly gifted. Traveling is one. As a person with limited vision, travel can be a challenge. But God has gifted me over the years with the ability to use my phone to read signs, to navigate through airports. I have a reasonably good sense of direction. I think I mentioned in one of my earlier podcasts how I've learned, I don't know that my hearing and my other senses are any better than anyone else's. I've learned to maybe tap into those and utilize those a little bit more. God has allowed me to lean into travel and exploring this beautiful planet. And also, I'm not afraid to ask for help as I'm navigating through an airport that I'm unfamiliar with. I will usually ask for assistance finding my airline gate so that I don't bumble around and miss the flight, take too long to get to the gate and miss the flight. But there's a number of examples in my own life that I can think of where God has called me to do things that I'm not really gifted at. As I mentioned in one of my earlier podcasts, walking through the coffee fields. not something that a person with low vision would normally be called to do, would normally have skills to do. And when I first got to the first coffee field I walked through, I thought, okay, God, where have you brought me now? What have you led me here for? But through leaning into Him and through seeking out His will, I've been able to, hopefully most of the time, discern His will and learn the skills, or allow Him to give me the skills to fulfill His purpose. That's pretty much the message that I had for you tonight. I had a couple of other examples, but this has gone on a little longer than I thought it would. So with that, I will again request that you let me know if you've gotten value from this. If you're interested in being added to my email list, I'm starting to build an email list, which I will be starting to use in the very near future. Or if you have suggestions for topics, if you have things you'd like me to cover, I'm always open to those ideas too. If there are things you'd like to share with me offline, feel free to direct message me, particularly with your email address. If you'd like to be added to my email list, put an email in the comment, put the word email in the comments, and I will reach out to you directly and get your email address. Don't feel like you have to put your email address publicly in the comments. And shoot me any comments you have, either in the comments or direct message me, because I'm always open, and this podcast is beginning to evolve. So I would welcome any feedback or comments you might have. So with that, I will bid you farewell and a good evening. I do hope you've appreciated this and gotten some value. And until next time, thank you for joining the Karey Carbaugh podcast. Make it a great week and a blessed week. And again, do something nice and helpful for someone else that you come in contact with this week. Thanks for watching, and have a great week. Good night.